Hi everybody, welcome to our mini lecture about constitutions and civil and political rights. Last week we talked about types of government. We talked about democratic government and non-democratic government. One thing that is common to many of the democratic or almost all democratic governments and also to some non-democratic governments is that they have or they rely on a constitution. Growing up in the United States, you probably heard a whole lot about the US Constitution and what is a constitutional law or not. But let's try to understand exactly what a constitution is and what it means in the context of the United States. The Constitution, as it says here, is the structural document at the foundation of a government. What does that mean? It means that we have a document, we have it written down exactly how the government is structured, what are the different branches of government and what is the relationship between them, and also things like setting the electoral system. Who can run to office? What are the term limits? Who can vote? How often elections take place? And so the Constitution becomes this blueprint of government operation. Now, in many of those cases, or in all of those cases, the Constitution, once it's approved, becomes the supreme law of the land. And it becomes really hard to change it or amend it. Having said that, we do know that even in the context of the United States, but in all other countries, we do see amendments, additions, and sometimes countries decide to kind of rewrite the Constitution. So that would take a bigger effort, but still we are focusing on writing this structural document that describes us the operation of the government of that country. Now, constitutions can be short, like the United States Constitution, or they can be very, very long. And we'll talk in a minute about which one could be better. One real big advantage with the Constitution when it comes to government is that it establishes both impartiality and predictability. We can't just have a government that operates in one way today, but tomorrow somebody else comes to power and say, well, I don't like that I have term limits, or I'm not giving up my power even though I lost the elections, right? So we have that in the Constitution and we can refer to it whenever there is an issue or a problem. But a Constitution, again, as almost everything else, has to be legitimate or seen as legitimate by the population. One thing that we know, I said, a constitution defines the structure of the government. In many democratic countries, we write into the constitution these checks and balances. And this is where we are limiting the power of any one part of government. So we don't want a government that is concentrated in one person, but we also don't want a government that is concentrated in one branch of the government. And we want accountability in the system. So for example, electoral accountability, this idea that we can vote people in and out of office, is part of those checks and balances. Elected officials know that if they violate the trust of their constituents, they will not be there the next time that there are elections. And so that's one check on power and the government. The separation of powers. So in the United States, we have three branches. and this is again the case in many other governments. We have the legislative branch, which is Congress. We have the executive branch, which is the president and other executive branch agencies. And then we have the judiciary branch, which is represented by the federal court system with the Supreme Court at the top. And each of those branches has those things that it allows to do. And in the United States, a lot of times we ask for the branches to approve each other. And so if there is a proposal for a new law, it will go through Congress. It will go through both houses of Congress. Once they approve it, you still need the president to sign it into law. If the president doesn't, then it doesn't become a law. This is where we talk about the veto power of the president. But still there is another check on that, because Congress can build a supermajority to override a presidential veto if we think that the president has been abusing their power. And then finally we have the check from the Supreme Court to say, is this law in line with the Constitution, with this foundational with the foundational principles of our government, or is it not? In some parliamentary systems, not like the United States, say in the UK, for example, we do see more power concentrated in the legislative, because the prime minister is usually the head, or is always the head of the largest party, or the party that was able to build a coalition. And so there is kind of coexistence between the executive and the legislative branches. But in most of those systems, there are still different checks and ways for the legislative to topple the executive, or for the executive to check the legislative. Another way to create checks and balances is federalism, right? So if you think about the separation of power, the different branches of government as a horizontal checks and balances, in the United States and in Canada and in a number of other countries, Germany, we also have a vertical check, which is the federal system. So governments can be unitary, such as in the UK, for example, or at least in the UK until very recently, where the national government is in control of everybody who lives in the territory, right? Completely in control, and there are no state or provinces government, and local governments are not as powerful, right? We have systems of confederations where the central government, the national government, is very weak, and most of the power is concentrated in the states, in the different units. If you look at the at the European Union right now, that's kind of how it is built. And then finally, we have a system like the federalism that we have in the United States, where the national government has a lot of power, but also the states have power. And again, the Constitution defines the relationship between the federal government and states government. Pay attention in the United States, in the case of the United States, to the 10th Amendment, that basically is saying that stuff that's not written or not discussed in the Constitution is reserved to the states. And so this is one area where we do get a lot of disagreement between people who believe that the Constitution is not as strong as some others would like it to be, because it does leave a lot of power to the states. Right? So let's look on the US federal constitution. It came to power in March 4th, 1789. It governs all the states, all 50 states right now, and all the people that live in the territory. Right? It describes the branches, the executive, legislative, and judiciary, and it describes the federal system, what rights states have, what authority does the national government have. It is also very short. It only has 7 articles, and it's only it really is the shortest, or at least one of the shortest constitutions that we can find. And it is vague. It's not very clear or very specific about almost anything. And so it comes to the question of, what are the advantages and disadvantages of having a short and vague constitution? And this is a pause point for you. I would like you to now stop this mini lecture and go down and write down what do you think are advantages and disadvantages here. Okay, I will give you some ideas about why is it good that we have a short and vague constitution. It is good because we can then amend and change, and we leave a lot of the details to the people who live at the moment, right? And so this is where there is a lot of power to there is a lot of staying power to the Constitution, because arguably it could be evolved and it could meet the demand of times, even though we do have technological and other changes, right? At the same time, there are also disadvantages, because a very short and vague constitution doesn't give answers to a lot of day-to-day questions, or sometimes to big questions. Look at the Second Amendment, for example. Look at the right to bear arms. What exactly does it mean? What is a regulated militia? You know, all of those questions. What did the founders mean in their words? They weren't very specific, and that creates a lot of disagreement later on. And interpretations, which, if we interpret one part of the Constitution, why can't we interpret the other part? Now, a lot of those questions are reserved to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, or justices on the Supreme Court, have to kind of decide which side they're on. How do they understand the Constitution? Do they support originalism? This idea that we are trying to follow the word of the Constitution and try to understand the intent of the founders at the time? Or do we treat the Constitution as a living Constitution, one that can be reinterpreted time and time again and be amended and meet the demands of the time? This is where we see very clear distinctions between some of the more conservative justices and the more liberal justices. And again, treat this one as another pause point. Stop what you're doing right now and think to yourself, what do you think? How should we understand the US Constitution? Would you like to follow originalism, or this idea that it is a living constitution? Okay, another thing that we have to remember when we discuss constitutions is that a lot of times the Constitution is there in order to preserve civil rights and liberties. Civil rights and liberties are those things that are either inherent because we are human beings, or they are given by law, right? This idea that I can think whatever I want, that comes with nature, but it is also safeguarded by law. And this idea is that the Constitution and laws need to safeguard the rights of people and limit the government. One big question about that, and as you know, here in the United States, we are still dealing with those questions, and of course, everybody around the world do as well. Who is covered by those protections? Are slaves covered? Are they not covered? Are female covered? They're not covered. Are different ethnic groups, different racial groups, right? We are moving towards this idea that everybody should be covered, all citizens, and should be covered equally, but it is a process and something that we constantly see the struggle between the groups who want to have some limits and the groups who want to have more inclusion. And think about voter rights, think about participation in the system when you are trying to judge does the United States Constitution cover civil rights and liberties or not. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president during World War II, have discussed this idea that we should at least cover freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and also freedom from fear and freedom from want. Freedom from fear is both protections, but also the equal standing in front of the law. This idea that the government cannot just jail me because of how I look, right? But freedom from want discuss other things. For example, does the government have any responsibility when it comes to, do I have enough food to eat? What is my education? What kind of education do I get? What kind of healthcare do I get, right? And so we can always, or we should always pause and ask ourselves, does our country live by the principles of protecting civil rights and liberties? And as an academic endeavor, as I showed you last week, we do have organizations such as the Freedom House that go in and really rate countries about how well they do when it comes to civil rights and liberties. And so by that, I'm going to end this mini lecture and read the chapter, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in our Zoom session.